Ooh, that's pretty gnarly. Ooh. So there's this technique that I've been using recently on like snaps and claps and even like shaker loops if they're sufficiently noisy, where I kind of use wave shaping to really reshape the tone of the sound in a way that you can't quite do if you like just use EQ or something. So let's just like go into that. So here's a little clap sound. Fairly straightforward. The technique just involves like using like three plugins. It's really quite basic in that regard. It's just an EQ, M waveshaper, and another EQ. So M waveshaper, it's a fairly like box standard wave shaping plugin. Any kind of wave shaper will do. I just use M waveshaper because it's free. One thing to notice, like it starts by default with a dry wet at like 50, so turn that up. You can choose these different modes here. So the mode kind of introduces the scaling of the graph here. Doesn't technically matter, but I just find that using something like cubic tends to kind of give me nice results. So what I do is I just very simply create a point on the wave shaper and I kind of drag it so you get kind of a curve like this where it's very low for a bit and then it kind of shoots up very high. Sometimes I like to curve this bit. So let's just hear like what that does. And immediately we hear that the clap, I mean, it's a lot more quiet now, but it's also a lot crunchier. So if you just crank the makeup gain a little bit, it's a lot more crunchy, it's a lot more dry. So we very drastically alter the tone without ever even like touching an EQ or loading a different sample. And that's what makes this technique so fun to play with, is that you can take the claps and snaps that you already have and just really crunch them up by a lot and do all these weird things with them. So I tend to just experiment with like where I put this note and kind of like shaping these curves a little bit. Yeah, so you can hear as I keep it kind of low and I drag it from left to right, it becomes more and more crunchy. Whereas if you go all the way here, it just kind of fizzles out because it just becomes too crunchy to handle, basically. Yeah. If you go up more into this area, the whole thing tends to just turn into this big burst of noise, which could be cool for some kinds of sounds, but I'm usually not a huge fan of it. So at that point, there's just the two EQs, and the use of them is very straightforward. The EQ that comes after the wave shaper, I tend to mostly just use it to kind of high pass because wave shaping with a curve like this on something noisy tends to misbehave and create a bunch of low frequency stuff that I'd rather not have in there. And sometimes there's also a certain frequency area starts to sound very nice, so I like to bring that out a little bit with the EQ. This clap is kind of neutral, it doesn't have much of a strong resonance anywhere. So for that reason, nothing here jumps out, but that's what the first EQ kind of can do nicely. So you can create these resonances in the spectrum, and when you do that before the wave shaping, it kind of affects how the wave shaping does its thing. So get that very, yeah, sort of hollow sounding almost. You can get something very bright. Let's look at some other examples. So here's a fairly standard 808 clap sample. Pretty straightforward. So just do the same thing. Ooh, that's pretty gnarly. So let's try it on this snap. So with the snap, you have this very clear sort of resonance at like 2.5K or something. Let's see what happens if we fuck with that. And immediately the whole thing just becomes so much tighter. Oh yeah, this is great. Now, by bringing out those higher frequencies, we get something that's just... It's super bright and snappy, but it's also very clean. There's not much of a tail there, which can be cool. This technique does tend to destroy tails a little bit of the sound, but you can always like add some reverb. I like Ableton's like convolution reverb. Anyway, let's just first like finish this off. So yeah, maybe the reverb here would be nice. So I tend to just use hybrid reverb just on the convolution mode, so blend to all the way to the left, and then just pick a early reflections that sounds nice. Stock one is actually quite natural. I like it. I also tend to like reflex. Blend that in subtly, and it's like a little bit of spatial perception can be really nice. Let's try another one. That's a very slimy sounding clap. God. Maybe we can see if we can do something with that slimy mid-range. I'm already going to boost it before I even get into this, and ooh. Oh god. Sometimes if you pick a different algorithm, like sometimes I find I have to kind of push myself to the extremes to get the sound that I want. Just choosing a different mode here can sometimes make it less fiddly. It's just down to experimentation, really. Nice. So I think that's just a drastically different sound from what we started with. Like you wouldn't even have guessed that that's the same sample. It sounds completely different. And that's what's so fun about this technique, is that you can really sort of reshape certain sounds. Let's try it on this like seed shaker loop. So for this, I would maybe also introduce a compressor, because it tends to have these little like dynamic spikes here and there that can sometimes go a little bit crazy, because essentially if you think about it, you know, if you do this technique on a sample of a clap or a snap or something, it's the same sample every time. So the result is going to be predictable. But this, all these little hits are different. And you can see some of them, this one, for example, peaks very high for very short, whereas the others are maybe a little more behaved. So a compressor can sometimes be nice to kind of reel that in a little bit. But we'll see if we need it. It might just be fine. We'll see.
A few moments later.
Like always with these kinds of sounds, even introducing like a frequency shifter can be a nice idea, because it's a noisy sound. It doesn't really have much of a tonal quality, so it doesn't matter if we destroy that. And ooh, that's super crunchy. I mean, I wouldn't use something like that in a mix very often, because it kind of goes too far down for a shaker. But maybe if you have kind of a weird mix, it could work. Yeah, super spicy. So before we end the video, I just wanted to give a real quick example of a situation in which I've used this technique in an organic context. So here's some house drums. Don't mind the kick too much. It's maybe clipping a little bit too much. Whatever. So yeah, the clap consists of a few layers. So let's go through these one by one. Very straightforward clap serum preset that I made. It's in my Discord server, I believe. You can, that's you can download this. Anyway, here is another clap sample, and that sounds, it has a super grainy sort of quality. that I like. And if we listen without the processing, not very grainy at all. So that's what this technique is very good at bringing out. So if you look at, it's a pretty familiar looking shape. Same for this layer. It's pretty like crunchy and tactile almost. Again, a familiar shape. If we compare that to the original sound, it's a lot more wet, it's a lot more diffuse. This is just super crunchy. And yeah, that's kind of two crunchy layers. That's kind of how this clap works. And then one to give it just a bit of body, quite dry. And they layer quite nicely, I think. In the context of the groove, of course. So here's another example where I've used this technique. This is a little kind of garagey sort of beat that I made yesterday. Let's go over here and just take a listen to it. So, I mean, obviously here is an example where I've used it on the shaker. So you can hear, without the wave shaping, the wave shaping, it just brings out, again, this crunchy, crackly sort of texture. It's a lot more percussive. It's a lot more tight. And I didn't even do any sort of transient shaping that changes anything. I mean, I guess you could consider the wave shaping as sort of transient shaping, because in this case it's bringing out the transients more and it's suppressing the rest, but it's not transient shaping in the traditional sense. You can see also that in this chain I shifted it down, the whole thing, but actually quite a lot on the frequency shifter. It's kind of what it sounded like before. Stereoized it with Ozone Imager, making it sound kind of super dirty almost. If you shift a loop like this down like that far, it tends to sound really nasty because you shift a whole lot of it into, as far as the lower mid-range or even the subs. But that's fine because I'm gonna high pass it anyway after the waveshaper, so it's a world of difference that you make with plugins like that, and that's why it's such a fun technique. And then this is actually another it's another layer of that wave shaping technique. Actually, in this one I've kind of crunched it super hard. You can see some like clipping like shape up there, and then I just gated the whole thing so it wouldn't be constantly there. Just adds a little bit of grit. And yeah, just like standard mixing things like EQ and compression. Well, what an EQ that is. But yeah, hopefully you can see how this technique can be used to inspire endless creativity and other fancy words like that. But really, I've had a lot of fun with this technique, so I hope that you do too. Thank you very much. Why do you end with thank you very much? What is that? Okay, whatever.